had like a little triangle saying, you better go live before 4:09 p.m. Eastern, or we're not going to let you do that. But we're live now. And look, we all have our Twitter handles at the bottom of our page. We're live on my Twitter. Neal, if you want to retweet it, it'll probably spike it, spike the viewership. But we're also live on the Educational Freedom Institute Facebook and YouTube channels, and then my personal Facebook and YouTube channels as well. We're super excited to have Neal McCluskey here with us today. What's interesting is Neal McCluskey is the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute, and we're on the Educational Freedom Institute podcast today. Similar names. I'm actually super jealous of your title, Neal. I want to switch my title from Director of School Choice to Director of Educational Freedom. I don't know how much that would be overlapping. That might be overlapping too much with your title, though. So maybe I'll stick with Director of School Choice. I did a poll with my Twitter followers the other week, and 90% of them liked Director of Educational Freedom better. So super jealous. But yeah, it looks like we have a good amount of followers. Matthew, you want to get into quick introductions? Then we'll talk with our special guest.
Yeah, and we'll start our conversation. So I'm Matthew Nielsen. I'm the board chair and founder at the Educational Freedom Institute. As always, we're joined by Corey DeAngelis, the executive director at EFI. He's also the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. We have, I don't know if I'm going to say this right. Maybe I shouldn't even say it, but this may not be true. I think it's true, though.
The man, the myth, the legend.
The former,
that's true.
former boss of Corey DeAngelis. Is that right?
Yeah.
Bingo.
Okay. I thought so. So Neal McCluskey, welcome. He, as Corey mentioned, he's the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. He's the author of many books and articles and so on and so forth, other publications. So welcome, Neal. We appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was just going to tell Corey that anything that sounds like Center for Educational Freedom has already been copyrighted, so you can't touch it or you'll be sued. And we could probably spend a whole episode talking about whether it should be education freedom or educational freedom.
We need to get Randy Burke on the call to discuss that.
I think Corey and I are the few in the camp that say educational freedom, although, as I often say, both sides have legitimate concerns about
I think it rolls off the tongue better, right? Educational freedom. And I think others point out, well, we have economic freedom. We don't have economical freedom, which is true, but we also have political freedom. But we don't have
politics freedom.
Political freedom. But it's okay, right?
You don't want to get too caught up in grammatical rules and things because language evolves like everything else. And so educational freedom may sound better, and so people go with that. And there is nothing wrong with using it.
And I want to point out
except if you violate my copyright, then there's a problem.
Okay,
then there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Matthew pointed out that Neal is an author or editor of several books. I also want to point out that Neal and I have a book coming out. We both co-edited together and edited a co-edited volume called School Choice Myths. If anybody wants to get a copy of that, it's available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Might be on a couple of other sites, but I'll share that link for the listeners. I think it's only $24.95. You'll be able to take on all of the most pernicious myths in the school choice debate for the low price of $24.95. Again, it's available for pre-order, but it will be available for regular order starting in October. But I'll get a link in a second.
October 7th, I think, is the official release date, something like that.
Sorry for blocking you out, Matthew.
No, it was actually good. In fact, right when you put it up, I scratched my nose. It was itching, and I thought, I don't want to do that on camera. But behind a book cover, I could easily do that and not get in trouble. So it was perfect. Thank you. So, Neal, so we talked about the book. We talked a little before we jumped on about your chapter in there. But I think before we get too much into any particular topic, I think it would be cool if we could hear more about you, how you got interested in education in the first place, just a little about yourself.
Sure. Well, I mean, I have a long and storied history. I won't go into the whole thing. But what I'll say is, I mean, the reason that I got into education policy, in part was it's really important, education policy, how we raise kids, what we teach them, how we teach them, what sorts of values and things we instill in them is extremely important. And I also thought that when you looked at the education system, it was very clear that it wasn't doing a very good job. At least it wasn't doing that good a job for the money. And then as kind of a broadly libertarian take on things, I also thought it was sort of like the soft underbelly of the welfare state, and that it seemed so obvious to me that it was an incorrect way to deliver education to say that everybody is assigned to a school that's run by government. It didn't make sense at a very basic level in a society, in a country that's supposed to be grounded in individual liberty. It didn't seem to be working based on what we spent on it. The idea that every child is more or less identical and then should therefore get an identical education seemed nonsensical in light of basic human nature and reality. And so I thought it would be that it was the area that we could see the most progress being made, or we could make the most progress in sort of dismantling some things that we've set up as a country that are really at odds with a vision of a country that is based in individual liberty.
Interesting. So when was that? Was this during your undergrad? Was it during grad school? During your doctorate program? Like, when did you start to go, yeah, you know what, I'm interested in that?
Well, I mean, so I went to school, and so already just having experience as a student helps to shape what you think. I was in the military, though, for not that long. I'm no military expert or anything like that, but while I was in the military for 4 years, I encountered a lot of people who I thought maybe would have benefited from a better education system. And so that was something that I thought a lot about. Well, this is a very long, not painful story, but long story. It's basically, when I was looking for policy work in DC, somebody who I interned for way back in the early 1990s had started a think tank called the Center for Education Reform. That was Jeannie Allen, who you probably know. And I ended up working for her for a little while in education. I also taught for a couple of years between the Army and going into policy. I don't claim any expertise in pedagogy or anything like that. But it also gave me some experience in education, although not a whole lot of policy experience. And again, I'm not an expert in any way in pedagogy, but that also got me into education policy. I was either going to do defense or education policy, but education policy was just more important. I think domestic policy is, it's all important, but domestic policy has a lot more obviously immediate effect on what happens to the people in the country as opposed to defending them from what goes on outside the country. So that also got me into education policy. But, it was probably a combination of a lot of things. But first and foremost, the way we run education just does not seem at all consistent with how a free country should operate.
Yeah.
What's in your view the biggest issue with how we currently run education, and what do you think it should look like? What are some proposals? What's your ideal scenario with education? A couple of those.
So there's ideal versus what we can actually achieve right now. So ideally, we have an education system that is basically grounded in a free society. We use the term often free market, but that term is problematic in that people think of everything as sort of a cold economic exchange, which it isn't. A free society has all sorts of things, or has a whole lot to do with people who have affections and connections and bridges to lots of different people that have nothing to do with an economic exchange. And so I think it should be grounded in a free society where people freely interact voluntarily with other people for all sorts of reasons that they may have to do so. And that is what drives the educational choices we make. That drives what schools we choose. It drives how educators choose to deliver education, what they choose to deliver in education. And then we get together, families and educators, on a voluntary basis. That leaves not a whole lot of role for government, but there are a few things government should do. I think clearly if there's any case of negligence or abuse when it comes to a child, that we have a role for government to step in to keep that from happening. And I think that includes that children are entitled to be equipped with at the minimum, the skills they need to become learners themselves. So that means they should have a basic level of literacy, of the ability to write, and of numeracy. I haven't said exactly what those levels should be, but education is a little bit tougher than some issues for libertarians, because we're not talking about people capable of self-government. We're talking about kids who we assume are not capable of that. And, as they get older, they're more capable of it, but certainly at the beginning, they're not. And so somebody is forcing decisions one way or another on a child. And so there may be a role for government to say, look, if the parent is not supplying education, we need to make sure it happens. I also think that should be basically on a sort of innocent until proven guilty basis, where you need suspicion that somebody's not educating their child. You need to investigate that. And then parents get to, go to a court of law if it comes to that, to demonstrate they are or are not supplying education. That's the ideal. We're very far from the ideal because most people don't have any experience with, or even the notion that they should be controlling how their kids are educated. And so that's why school choice is the thing that I focus on a day-to-day basis. Getting more money basically attached to kids, giving educators the autonomy to teach as they think it's right, and then letting the parents move the kids with that money attached to them to the schools that they think are best for their unique children.
Mm-hmm.
So, Neal, you talked a little bit about how you think we should be innocent until proven guilty, and I agree with you. It reminds me a little bit about this proposal that just came out from Harvard Law School professor Elizabeth Bartlett to turn that around and to have a presumptive ban on homeschooling, essentially making us all guilty until proven innocent. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts of this cartoon that came out in Harvard Magazine a couple of months ago? And maybe just what's your take on this debate and where you think it's going to go?
Right. Well, the first thing I note is I think you're using the newer version of that picture where it was spelled right.
I was going to say the same thing, Neal. Yeah.
That's generous to whoever put together Harvard. So I wouldn't say of two minds on this debate, but I can see and sympathize with some of the concerns that are expressed by Professor, I'm not sure whether I'm saying her name right. I thought it was Bartolet, but it could Bartlett. Regardless, we're actually going to, June 15th at noon, we're having an event at Cato with her and Milton Gaither, who was going to be at the summit they were having, and then Carrie McDonald, who you all know and all your viewers know, who's an adjunct at Cato. We're going to talk a lot about this, but at least as a preview of my thoughts on it, I am sympathetic to concerns, especially about homeschooling could be used as a way to keep kids away from the view of adults outside the family, and that could be concerning if those children are being abused. And there have been examples of that. And I think it's a reasonable discussion to say, again, understanding that kids are not capable of self-government, which makes this a little harder from a libertarian perspective. There may be a role to say somebody needs to at least be able to check on those kids and make sure they're okay. That leads to a lot of problems, though, because we don't want to empower government to decide you're okay, you're not okay, and who we're taking families. But it's a reasonable concern to say we want to have some ability to find these kids who may be in terrible situations, and their kids and their parents or guardians, whoever it is, are saying, well, we're not sending them to school, we're homeschooling. And that's really just a way to keep those kids out of sight, that we should look into what we can do to try and minimize that. So I think that that's certainly a legitimate question. I think that the professor's article, based on a law review article from 2018, makes a lot of assumptions and suppositions and paints with a very broad brush of homeschoolers that is far beyond what the evidence supports. And so That needs to be dealt with. I don't think that there's the evidence that it suggests there is, that abuse is somehow widespread among homeschoolers. And it fails to counterbalance what are cases of abuse among homeschoolers with also cases of abuse among teachers in physical schools, private schools, certainly in public schools. And that all needs to be looked at too. But at least from the very beginning, it's set aside the evidence, but as a concern, it's legitimate to worry about kids being abused. I am less sympathetic to the argument that, well, we have to have kids go to public schools because otherwise they don't learn diverse views and they'll become bigoted because their parents are probably, the broad brush again is they're all sort of evangelical Christians who are just trying to teach their kids what may be kind of narrow-minded, to put it nicely, ways of thinking. I am not nearly as sympathetic to that concern because I don't think that there's a lot of evidence that people go to public schools and they get a wide variety of views to which they're exposed. And I'm really worried about giving the government the ability to standardize thought, to establish orthodoxy in a society by saying all kids must learn X, not learn Y, at least not learn at the schools we're taking their money to provide, and say, if you learn Y, there's probably something wrong with you. That is very dangerous. And so I'm much less sympathetic to that. We're probably going to talk about both these things June 15th. But, and again, I think that the Law Review article was way too broad a brush about homeschoolers generally. Was very sort of started off hostile to homeschooling as an idea. And all of that is very problematic.
So I have a quick question that's maybe a little bit of a tangent, but if it's too much, just tell me and we won't talk about it. But you just talked about government, the government schools generally, and certainly compulsory government schooling is a bad idea because of your feeling that we don't want to box people in and send people all down the same track when everyone isn't the same and everyone doesn't have all the same preferences and so on and so forth, right? So I'm with you on that. I just read this book. I don't know if you've read it or not, but it's by Yuval Levine at AEI, and it's called A Time to Build. Does that ring a bell at all, Neal?
I know the book. I haven't read it yet. Okay.
So I've been back and forth just with Robert Pondicio about this over the past couple of weeks. And it's interesting in the book, he talks about how important it is that we start to rebuild, which is time to build, right? Our institutions. And a lot of it, there's a lot to agree with in the book. Some of my hesitations are really around what you're talking about right now. But, my more libertarian side starts to tap on my shoulder and say, wait, hold on. Maybe all of these institutions weren't the best to begin with in the first place. Maybe they were, and they've fallen apart and we need to rebuild those. But maybe just your general take on public schooling as an institution and whether it needs to be rebuilt or whether it needs to be rethought.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on public schooling as an institution. You probably don't want them all. And I talk about some of this. I'm going to talk about some of this in the chapter of the book that you guys talked about. I've got another book I'm working on that goes into way more depth about this, which I think is almost finished, at least to send to more people to tell me it's all wrong. But I think public schooling as an institution, first of all, was well-intentioned. I think most people who are involved in this have good intentions. The idea of public schooling, especially when you start to see it really develop, you could look at founders. People always like to point to Thomas Jefferson and say, see, Thomas Jefferson wanted public schools, therefore every libertarian and everybody in the world should want public schools. And there were certainly a fair number of founders who said we should have some sort of unifying schooling system. And you could understand why they said that, because you were talking about a new country that had just had a revolution, where people were at most attached to their states far more than one nation, where it was sort of a new experiment in people being sovereign, individuals being able to vote, to have a direct say in who their leaders were. And you can understand why people were concerned. They didn't want to have a revolution like in France where people were beheaded. They thought that you had to have a virtuous citizenry, otherwise they would use their power and their freedom for bad things. And you said, I get it. That makes sense if you're scared of all these things, and if you think that government has the ability to change almost the fundamental nature of people. And different founders had different views on this. Jefferson's was more to say, educate the people so they recognize when a demagogue or somebody was trying to get power and may use it against them. Others, Benjamin Rush, for instance, in Pennsylvania, it's like, you got to take their heads and make their minds all the same, or when they get older, they'll be dangerous because they'll all have different thoughts. So there are different strains of this. But the idea of public schooling wasn't crazy, which is, at the very beginning of the country, you want to have some unity, and they're afraid they wouldn't. But as you move on, not too far in U.S. history, you realize there was sufficient unity for a country. There was sufficient unity for peace. There was sufficient unity for states certainly having functional governments. Obviously, there were lots of problems. But as a general idea, things were working okay in terms of people weren't all splitting apart. Now, of course, slavery is a huge issue. How government dealt with African Americans, a huge issue. We do eventually split as a country because of the Civil War. There's no reason to believe the public schools were going to change that. But there was also no reason to believe that without public schools, there could be no unity. And that was essentially what the argument was. And Horace Mann eventually said, you know what, we got to have everybody going to common schools or nobody would have any virtue. And all these idiot people, who was basically everyone who wasn't like Horace Mann in his view, would do a bunch of stuff that he thought was terrible. What was interesting, of course, Horace Mann homeschooled his kids.
Yeah.
And in Massachusetts, there wasn't... The idea of common schooling was heavily debated even in Massachusetts. It wasn't picked up nearly to the extent it was in Massachusetts and other places. And what we ended up seeing was that people didn't need public schools, again, to sort of exist and to educate their kids, to have some commonality. We have another sort of big wave of desire for standardization through schools when we have immigration, especially in the 1880s. I mean, you can start in the 1840s, the 1880s. And what do we see about immigrants? And maybe this is the most informative period, was that immigrants actually wanted to assimilate. They wanted to, you come to this country, and they came to this country because they wanted to be successful. And to be successful meant you did a lot of things the way that other Americans did it. But you didn't want to have it imposed on you. For one thing, new immigrants, especially the adults who come here as new immigrants, you just can't change that much that fast. You cannot learn a new language like you are a native speaker. You will not abandon your religion or your food or things like that just outright because you want to be suddenly exactly like whatever an ideal American was. But our education system and a lot of other things said, oh, you're terrible if you're not exactly like the model of the perfect American. And a lot of people resented that. But what we saw was even that first generation did a lot of things to assimilate. They knew they had to speak some English. They had to work with people who were outside of their, their cultural and ethnic group. And then the next generation totally wanted to assimilate because everyone recognized sharing common things with the rest of the society was beneficial to them. It even just made them feel more comfortable, but they weren't prepared to abandon things like their religion that was central to their identity. And we tried to force them to do that. And what we learned is force just has a negative outcome. It just makes people resent the society and the people who are trying to force them to do things, and leaving them alone, their own natural incentives will cause them to become part of sort of mainstream America. And so all the historical evidence is the public schools don't do what we're told they're going to do, which is take us and make a unified whole. And of course, they told African Americans, you cannot come into these schools. And they told, in some places, Mexican Americans they couldn't do that, and Asian Americans. And then the ones they did let in, they often said, in particular, think of Irish Catholics, so you can come to school, and they're going to make you into a model you don't want to be. And so the intention did not translate into something that did what it was supposed to do, create a unified, cohesive whole. It did the opposite. It forced people into conflict over the things that were really important for them. And conflict fractures. It doesn't unify.
Mm-hmm. So for our listeners, I want to read a really quick Benjamin Rush quote, since you brought him up, from 1786. And it kind of gets at this idea about the history of the public school system. Our schools of learning, by producing one general and uniform system of education, will render the mass of the people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. I think that kind of gets at what Neal McCluskey was talking about. So Neal, you talked a little bit about, or you kind of just hinted at how the uniform system that Benjamin Rush was talking about forces us into conflict. Can you talk about some of those examples of conflict today?
Sure. Well, so the conflict everybody could probably think of, or at least would come most to mind, I think, especially if you've read Inherit the Wind or something when you were in high school, but Inherit the Wind, you may remember, was about the Scopes monkey trial. Everybody probably has heard of the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. It was in Tennessee, and actually in Tennessee, they passed a law that said nobody will learn evolution. Everyone basically would learn creationism, because people thought if you taught kids evolution in school, you'd make them all sort of horrible atheists. And somebody, John Scopes, was a teacher, and this way he didn't just sort of stumble into it. He was trying to start a lawsuit with the ACLU, and I'm sure there were others, but he said, I am going to teach evolution because I think people need to know evolution, and I don't like the idea of learning religion in public schools. And so this leads to this, very big sort of three-ring circus of a trial. It's called I think it's called the Trial of the Century. H.L. Mencken wrote about it. But it was a really big thing. And of course, we know it's a big thing because it becomes a play and becomes a movie called Inherit the Wind. But this sort of, the battle over teaching evolution and creationism sort of captures the toughest part of public schooling, which is a public school cannot teach two things that are at odds with each other. You cannot teach both that evolution is correct and creationism, as in the earth was created in just a few days. You cannot treat them both as being true. And so, but you make people who believe creationism and believe evolution all pay for the public schools. That inevitably sets up a conflict about people's basic values, things that are incredibly important to them. They say, you're all paying for the schools, but only one of you gets the schools to teach what you think is very important. And so we've had lots of battles of evolution and creationism beyond just Inherit the Wind. There was a very famous one in 2005 in Dover, Pennsylvania, which led to a big court case. It wasn't a Supreme Court case, but a court case that said, look, you can't do anything in a public school that even hints basically at creationism maybe being right. And we continue to have battles over evolution and creationism across the country. I see the battle map is up now. You got to unclick those little dots if you want to focus on one particular thing. But evolution and creationism is probably like the ultimate one of these stories. There's another word I want, but I keep forgetting it. Anyway, but we have lots of other battles like this. I know, Corey, I saw you were tweeting about this. You guys might have discussed it at some point. In Alaska, there was a school district that just about a month or so ago said, we will not use 5 books. And there's a whole list of books. The Great Gatsby is probably the most famous. And they said, look, because we think that these books have content that is inappropriate for kids of certain ages. And then other people said, look, you are censoring literature, and what right do you have to decide what our kids read? And there's a lot of literary value in a lot of these books. And again, you can see decent people could come out on either side. If they're swearing, if there's sexual content, people say, I don't think this is appropriate for my kids. Other people can very reasonably say, no, this is all part of life, and kids are in school to learn about life. What's central is government should not be making these decisions for everybody, taking your money and saying, you will get what you want, you will not get what you want. You may actually get something imposed on your kids that you find is immoral, and that's a tough break. You're paying for it. Lots of other battles like this. These are just some of the ones that we're most familiar with. There are all sorts of ones about kids' hairstyle. Can you express yourself with a mohawk? People say, don't I have a right to free expression? The schools say, no, we'll have a disorderly environment and people won't be able to learn. You can understand what good people can come out on either side. And the public schools say, one will win, one will lose. That is a guaranteed way to make people fight. Or the other thing we see is schools will sometimes just avoid anything that could cause conflict. So one of the reasons we don't see more battles over creationism and evolution is that schools now just sidestep it. So the one way we avoid battles is we give you lowest common denominator content that's milquetoast and boring and doesn't give you a lot of information. But these two political scientists at Penn State, Berkman and Plutzer, in 2008, surveyed high school biology teachers and found that about 66% or so, they just give a very watered down evolution and then they move on because they don't want to incite conflict, and then nobody gets what they want.
So that's confusing to me, though, Neal, because I thought that public school districts were accountable to the public.
Well, in a way, they sort of are. So if you think about the way public schools are supposed to work, they're supposed to work with majority rules, right? Which is inherently problematic if you think individuals need to be treated equally. But the idea is that majority rules, and there is some evidence that in some school districts, if you have a pretty substantial majority of evolution supporters or creationism believers, that they'll get that taught. But otherwise, in a way, they are sort of reflecting their constituency. If they say, well, this is too hot to handle, we're just going to skip it. The problem there is you're just getting terrible education. You're getting education that's ripped out any sort of meaningful and engaging content. So it does sort of reflect what maybe the majority would like to see, which is they don't want to see conflict and they don't want to see something that they don't like. But again, that's terrible education. But really, the democracy aspect, democracy is good when you have to have government, but we try to minimize government because we don't want people with the most political power deciding for everybody what everybody gets, especially what their kids will learn.
What seems interesting to me as well is that we have a whole bunch of literature that finds that access to private school choice programs tends to lead to more tolerance of others' views, and I think it could be because, and if what you're saying is true, if the public schools just try to avoid all of this type of conflict, then they don't discuss and debate, controversial issues much in the school. And that could, lead to intolerance of others' views, since you just never hear about those other views and you never, logically debate them. That could be part of it. But I also wanted to press you on, have you ever gotten anybody respond by saying, well, why don't you track this for private schools and charter schools? Isn't it possible that, that these types of issues and conflicts can pop up in the private schools too? What's your response to that?
Yeah, so two things. We do actually track private schools. I don't keep a map of it because we just haven't found enough private school conflicts to justify having a map. I think we've got about 12 on there, and we've been collecting those, I think, around 3 years or so. And it may not be, I don't want to give anyone the false impression. It is possible that private schools would even have proportionately the same number or same amount of these sorts of conflicts. I don't think they do, but it could be because the way we get these battles is they're called from media reports. Every once in a while, somebody will send me something, and if you have one, please feel free to send it. But most of it's from media reports, and it is possible that private schools just don't get in the media as much as public schools. So it's hard to make an equivalency, certainly with any certainty, to say, well, we also collected for private schools, therefore we know that it is disproportionately low in private schools, that they don't have these conflicts. But we do track it, and at some point I'm actually going to publish that and write something about it. But so much of this is filtered through the media that it is quite possible that private schools, their conflicts just don't reach a reporter, and a reporter doesn't write about it. That is also a problem, though, for public schools. Last I checked, if you gather together all the districts that we have conflicts for, it's about 45% of all students are enrolled in those. So all students nationally are in those. But many, many school districts are very small and probably don't get a lot of media coverage. And so there are many battles we're probably not picking up that are in smaller districts. So all this is coming from media reports, which makes it hard to say, I know it's representative of all public schools or all private schools. The reason we put this together was because I was getting tired of seeing people saying that the public schools are the foundation of our democracy and that they unify people and that they teach us how to all get along, and they never provide any evidence. And the historical evidence, I think, is very powerful that that is not the case. And I wanted to put something together that at least let people realize we also continue to have these sorts of conflicts in the modern day. And it's something they can go to look at and see what kinds of conflicts they are, where they exist. And maybe if you're in a school district that's having one, you could even learn how some districts work their way out of those. But the reason it exists is because there was too much mythology that the public schools just, they take us all and we all sing Kumbaya because we're assigned to a school and we all get along. And for many reasons, that's not true. As far as charter schools go, I don't track charter schools because they're a little bit difficult to classify.
Quasi-public.
Yeah, they're both public and private, and I wouldn't exactly know where to put them. So I let charter schools go. I do include magnet schools or selective admission schools if they're controlled by a district, because then a district is making a decision for everybody. Whereas a charter school, you have sort of private management, you're sort of overseen by a district or some board, and it's just really hard to say which part is causing the conflict.
I think one of our listeners had a good point too, that, hey, with private schools, at least you're not forced into this conflict. You of course, it's tough to opt out once you already select a private school, but you at least get to select a private school, and then you can take your money elsewhere if the conflict is so divisive and that it's so against your inherent beliefs. You can at least get out of it. After a while. So I think it's another main difference.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is people who do not like this idea that private schooling would lead to more peace is people will say stuff like, oh, well, you're acting like everybody, gets along, or that people would go to a private school and they'd be okay if the private school, say it's a religious school, had a religious rule they disagreed with. And I get it that you could pick a school that has a rule you disagree with, but generally speaking, you pick a school because it offers things that you like. And so that you would somehow just sort of end up in a private school that teaches a whole bunch of things that you as a parent at least find offensive doesn't really make sense in sort of the logical chain of, I am picking a school, I will look at that school to see if it shares values similar to mine. And then you can expect it's going to have rules and content that you're going to tend to like. Doesn't mean, obviously, we do have some private school battles. People do sometimes disagree with what a private school does, but it's logically, it seems like it would be very rare. And at least based on what you can pick up in media reports, it is pretty rare.
So we're hitting on private schools. A lot of our previous guests, we've been talking about homeschooling because of COVID-19. But you're one of the people in the spaces in the education reform space that has been talking about the effects of COVID-19 on private school closures. So could you share a little bit about the issues in that space?
Yeah. So if you like private schooling, if you like school choice, and if you like pluralism in education, if you like to have schools that can provide all sorts of different worldviews or ways of teaching math or all the other things that we disagree about, and lots of different people have lots of different ways of approaching it, you should be really worried that we are going to lose private schools. And COVID-19 and more importantly, the economic impact of the lockdown that we had, and the fact that, get rid of, don't even think about, state lockdowns or local lockdowns. People are going to sort of, I don't want to say pull in like turtles, but kind of pull in like turtles as long as there's a threat of infection. The economic impact of that is going to be felt the worst on private schools. I think it's definitely true that public schools are going to be seeing some pretty significant budget reductions, although people also need to know that budgets for public schools have gone way up over the last several decades, and it's now per pupil spending is at a record of $15,424, or was it $242?
Yeah, that's right.
Regardless, more than $15,000. But they're probably going to feel pain, but they're not facing existential pain. Private schools are, because private schools have had to compete against a free competitor for decades, probably about a century. And that's really hard to do. And the way many private schools do it is they are as inexpensive as they can possibly be, because the more tuition they charge, the harder it is to get somebody to give up the free thing to pay for those private schools. So many private schools have long been working on sort of shoestring budgets in order to make themselves as affordable as humanly possible. But if you're on that kind of budget, any sort of disruption really puts you at risk of death. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of private schools, is these are schools that have struggled for a long time, especially to compete against public schools, although lots of other things, importantly, impact any given school, and sectors of private schools have had lots of other problems. So we can't lay this all certainly at the feet of having a free competitor, but that is a fundamentally huge thing they have to overcome. And so I'm very worried that we're going to see lots of private schools go out of business because they simply cannot survive anymore in the environment they're in, especially when you've got this very deep economic downturn caused by this crisis. And so I have started to maintain just a tracker of the private schools that announced they're going out of business, not just closing their doors because of the lockdown, but permanently, in part because of COVID-19. Almost all of these schools, they're 44, I think, on the latest tracker, which I think I see scrolling right here. That's the latest one we published. We've added, I think, 2 schools since then. That went up Friday. We had 2 new ones today, so we're at 46 schools. But all but one, we don't have all the data on what I published here. All but one was in some sort of financial trouble before this. But we're really afraid we're going to lose way more than just 46 schools, hundreds of schools. And what's especially concerning from a public policy standpoint is there are a lot of reasons to not want the federal government involved in school choice or in education. One, because first and foremost, it's not constitutional. But I'm very concerned that the federal government is going to they've already done sort of one bailout for elementary and secondary education in the CARES Act. And there's a big debate about, well, how much of that money should be going to private schools? I worry that if there's an even bigger one and it can't go to private schools, then that's absolutely the end for most private schools. Because, again, their competitors are getting a huge infusion of money to remain free and be able to offer all sorts of stuff, and the private schools are going to be left high and dry. And again, you simply cannot continue in that sort of model. So part of the reason for this tracker is so people understand the threat to private schools, and so that policymakers see, look, if we do something huge, we should probably make sure that money follows the student. Otherwise, we lose the sector of education. That's really the only sector that can provide something fundamentally different from the public schools. Even charters can't provide religion in their education. Only private schools can do that, and homeschools. But in this case, we're talking about actual schools. And so I want to have this resource so people can see what is actually happening to private schools. And we tally the enrollment to those schools, because those kids, there's a good chance, especially if all private schools go away, that they have to be enrolled in public schools. And that means more cost to the public school. And we do a very simple calculation of, well, we spend $15,424 per student in public schools. What happens if all those kids end up the public schools? That's more expense while they're cutting their budget. So there's a lot of reason everybody should care about what happens to private schools as a result of COVID-19. And we're trying to make sure that there's something people can go to on a regular basis to see the impact.
So Neal, so on this topic, I want to get your response to a couple of things. One is, we obviously know that private schools, a lot could be closing, a lot already are closing, as you're showing with your tracker. But then there's a related policy. You have coronavirus relief funds going to private schools. What's your take on that? I already know your thoughts on federal government involvement, and they mirror my thoughts on this situation, I think, as well. And then related to that, I saw a tweet where someone was trying to say that being okay with this coronavirus relief fund is pretty much, I'll just read the tweet. She says, "It's kind of amazing the demands for a small government so that the free market can do its thing. And then as soon as the free market fails, you're begging for the government to come save the private institutions you demand to operate free of government interference." So what's your response to that? I think she was trying to take a jab at you. Yes, she was. How do you respond to those claims?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I do understand why people may look, if they look very superficially and say, wait, you say the Fed shouldn't be involved, and then you say, sounds like you're saying the Fed should be, and I'll get to that in a second. But for the idea that we're operating in a free market in education just makes no sense, and a lot of people use that against me. Anytime actually you bring up school choice, it's been amplified with COVID-19, but you bring up school choice and people are like, oh, I thought you wanted free markets. But as soon as there's trouble, you want government involved. Well, we don't have a free market. We have the government supplying free schools with massive amounts of money they take from taxpayers. So I would love a free market, and school choice moves us in that direction. But to act like saying that you shouldn't just bail out the public schools is an attack on free markets makes no sense. It's less of a free market if the government just chooses one sector to keep alive and then says, well, tough, the other one's just going to stop. That is not a free market. But the issue of the federal involvement is, that's a serious one, because the Constitution doesn't authorize the federal government to spend money on education outside of Washington, D.C., military, Native American reservations, other things where there is a constitutional power in those areas to control them. And so it's a legitimate concern of, well, should the federal government be supplying money then to private schools with coronavirus relief? I think we could have a great debate about whether coronavirus relief just generally is constitutional. But if we're not, either if we're going to accept that it's constitutional, or we're going to ignore that it's constitutional and we're still going to have the relief, then we have to say, well, what is the best way to deliver that relief? And so when I talk about this, it is in the context of, if there is going to be relief, what's the right way to deliver it? And the right way to deliver it is the right way we should be delivering education all the time. The money should follow the students to the school that the parents choose. That is how people are treated equally. That's how a free society should work. I mean, we can argue whether the government should be having any money involved, and that's a very interesting argument, but it's so far afield from where we are right now. Much more consistent with a free society where people are treated equally under the law is where the money follows the school to the child of the parent's choice. And that's what we should be aiming for at the state level, at the local level. And if there's going to be federal relief, that's what we should want at the federal level, because it's the right thing to do, just in terms of treating people equally. And because if we don't do that, I think we're going to see private schools killed off, at least in part, from a government decision to only support one type of school.
So, Neal, when you look at this tweet, would you think that whoever tweets this, myself or anybody else in the school choice movement, do you think that that's calling for complete federal involvement in funding students instead of systems? Or could you interpret it in a different way?
I never would have thought that until somebody on Twitter suggested that saying that means, well, you want it done on a national basis, which means the federal government ought to do it, as opposed to saying, wouldn't it be better if the money we spend on public schools, which happens to be $50,424 on average, which comes from lots of different sources, if it followed the kids? So I do not actually think that tweet or tweets like it mean, well, that must mean you want the federal government to take over education and deliver that money. Can I back up to one thing on the previous question, by the way? I don't know how in the weeds people want to get on the CARES Act, but I do think it's important to note, I actually, reading the CARES Act, think that Secretary DeVos has interpreted it incorrectly to say that money from the CARES Act should go to private schools strictly on a per pupil basis of how many enroll. I think if you read it, it does look like it's tied into Title I formulas and things like that. Just something important to note, because even if I want the law to say something, if it says something else, we need to follow the law, even if that law is unconstitutional. There's so many layers of things we should be doing that we don't. However, I also think it's worth noting that some people have written about DeVos like she is trying to take money from poor people and give it to like the uber rich. The uber rich are not most people who use private schools. Most people who use private schools are not wealthy individuals. Most private schools are not wealthy, and that needs to be understood. And then her interpretation of the CARES Act isn't actually crazy, because the CARES Act does enable public schools, even if they get money allocated according to a Title I or other government program formula. It does enable them to use that money for everyone, regardless of whether they're low income or kids with disabilities. And so what she said is, clearly this law is to help the whole country during coronavirus, and so the money should follow the students. Mm-hmm. I don't think when you push comes to shove that's the right interpretation, but it's not crazy, and there's no evidence she's doing it just because she wants to give rich people money that should go to poor people.
So on a related note, what do you think about the proposed micro grants?
Yeah, so
is that essentially the money following the student? And could you just go into what they are and then your take on it?
Right, micro grants are another problem on multiple levels. Nothing's ever simple. There are always lots of things to be considered. But in the world we live in, you better be able to make it simple, like a 10-second soundbite. But sorry for you guys, I can't do that. So micro grants are a small part of the CARES Act. I can't remember. It's either $180 million or $185 million. I think it's $185 million. But it's money that's sort of put at the discretion of the Secretary of Education to decide how it's used. And already that should concern people. We should be concerned when the legislature delegates authority to make unilateral decisions to the bureaucracy. And so I don't like microgrants for that reason. You can also go back to the whole Common Core debate and race to the top, which was part of the last sort of major federal stimulus that was part of sort of trying to combat the Great Recession. And that was a much bigger pot of money, $4.35 billion. But the Secretary of Education at that time, Arne Duncan, got to say, well, you want some of this money, states? You're going to have to give me proposals, and you're going to have to compete for that money, and I will decide, or at least my department will decide, who's worthy and who isn't. And oh, by the way, here are the points you're going to get for different things. And one of the things you got to do is have common standards common to a majority of states. You have to sign on to tests that are common to a majority of states and do some other things. That basically makes the Secretary of Education kind of like the king of education. Mm-hmm. And this microgrants program, by all indications, is basically the same thing. It's much smaller, but it's the same thing, where the secretary gets to decide, here are my priorities. States, if you want some of this money, you have to try and meet my priorities. So the microgrants, one of it is, you can essentially use it as a voucher to send or a state can set up essentially a voucher program to send kids to different schools, to attach the money to kids, which is generally good, but the process by which we got there is wrong. It's the secretary making that decision. And that's a violation of federalism. It's a violation of separation of powers, and therefore it is ultimately bad. And I think they also have to be some sort of online school, because it does have to have some sort of COVID connection. The second thing a state could do is have some sort of statewide online charter school. Again, because it does have to have some sort of COVID connection, and people are learning a lot online. And then it has an open-ended third possibility, which is, or also do something really, really innovative that we judge really, really innovative, and so you can get some of the money, which is also concerning, because it's kind of like, we won't even tell you what it is. You just come up with stuff and we will decide. So I think the idea of having models of delivering education, especially that are more compatible with the COVID-19 environment, that makes sense as policy, but the way this policy would be implemented is wrong. We don't want to have contests, I don't think, that sort of thing. And we don't want to delegate authority to a bureaucracy or to one person, to a secretary, to decide how that money goes. And so this program violates those things. And I guess we didn't learn from Race to the Top, where a lot of people are angry about that method of funding education.
So on a related note, and we're coming up to an hour, but we have to hit this before you get off, because this is one of the things that we've kind of talked about over the years. And I think a lot of people have pushed back against us on this because, Neal, you say you support school choice, But then, Betsy DeVos and Ted Cruz kind of proposed a federal school choice program. How can you be for school choice, but it be against school choice at the same time?
I know it's hard to win in this world. So I'm for school choice, but as I tried to make clear just a minute ago, I'm also for federalism and for the Constitution. And anytime the federal government does something, our first question should always be, is it allowed to do that in the Constitution? Does the Constitution give it the authority to do whatever it is we want to do? Now, I say that and people are like, oh, sure. Yeah. Welcome to the 19th century. Nobody thinks about that stuff anymore. And, to some extent, that's true. People don't think about it. And we've kind of suffered for a long time as a result. You think about the No Child Left Behind Act or Race to the Top, which people sort of across the board started to hate. One of the reasons we had those is because nobody thinks we should put constitutional bounds on the federal government anymore. So the first question then is, okay, I'm for school choice, but if you're talking about, say, a federal scholarship tax credit program, the question is, does the Constitution allow that? And it does not. People say, well, it lets you raise taxes, but it only the Constitution allows the federal government to raise taxes in order to have the money to execute the specific enumerated powers, not just so it can raise taxes for anything it wants. They'll say, what about the General Welfare Clause? Well, the General Welfare Clause, as we all know from reading our Federalist Papers, only introduces why those specific enumerated powers are there. You get these powers we're giving you so you can serve the general welfare. It doesn't itself give any sort of power. And so the Constitution does not allow these scholarship tax credits, even if we wish it would. And if you really wanted to, then amend the Constitution. The concrete concern is, if you have a federal school choice program, you have now put federal tentacles in private schools all over the country, and then you have sort of one-stop shopping to standardize all private schools. The NEA, the AFT, or anybody else who has a concern like, well, we can't let any school do X, Y, or Z. It used to be we'd have to go state by state to stop that from happening. Now we can just go right to Washington, and they can send that to all the private schools who are using these programs. So those are the reasons that you can be both for school choice and against federal school choice, because you like the Constitution and you recognize the fundamental dangers of centralized lawmaking, especially when it comes to something like school choice.
Well, and you lose your ability to vote with your feet, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that when the rubber meets the road, where the rubber meets the road is, I don't want everything to be standardized. I don't want everything to be the same, because I'm not the same as everybody else.
I don't want a Louisiana voucher program everywhere, right?
Right.
And if there is, I can't really move to another state that has a better one.
That's really important. We talk about laboratories of democracy. We are learning by different states adopting different school choice models, what works well and what works doesn't. Corey, if you have written a lot about Louisiana's program, doesn't work that well. Indiana's got a lot of problems. Maybe we want to be more like Arizona, but what's important if we want to make progress and innovate and not saddle everybody with a bad program is you've got to decentralize. You have to have different people trying different things and seeing what works well, what works better. And so, yes, those are innovation is anathema. Well, I should say centralization is anathema to innovation. And so we don't want the federal government being in charge of school choice. I should also say, though, to our friends at the federal government who are trying school choice, with their most recent proposal, they really have tried hard to, as best they can, be consistent with federalism. So they do a scholarship tax credit program, only for states that already have one. But that doesn't change the fundamental reality that the program itself, no matter how hard they try to make it tolerable, is not consistent with the authority given to the federal government.
It's like the 21 drinking age, right? Every state gets to pick whether they want to abide by the 21 drinking age, but then magically they all, Why would you not take the federal incentive?
Right.
So before we go, speaking of constitutional authority and education, I want to get your take on this video, Neal.
Okay.
And so the point is, if I'm president, Betsy DeVos's whole notion from charter schools to this are gone.
Yeah, so I remember when I remember that event, which was a while ago. As I understand it, he may have said a little more than that, but the point is, at the very least, the implication is that if elected president, he will sort of get rid of charter schools. He may get rid of school choice in some way. He was not actually, of course, the most vociferous about this. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were like, I'm going to take them and destroy all charter schools. The federal government doesn't have authority to do that. If they do try and do that unilaterally, we've got a very big problem on our hands. But it may also be a lesson to folks who are like, well, if we could get the federal money for our schools of choice, it would really be great. It would, maybe that would be sort of a painful lesson they need to learn, that you take the money, eventually you take the rules. And what has been the concrete thing that people have, or that candidates have pointed to is, well, I'm not going to outright try and ban these things, although sometimes they don't actually say they're not outright going to try and ban them. But they say, look, we have the charter school programs at the federal level that charter schools get money. We're going to use that money to decide which are okay and which are not okay charter schools. And so the real lever there is the money that schools have been getting from the federal government. And so President Biden could, at least work to change those programs. He actually does, as far as I know, still need to work through a legislature, and laws still have to be passed and all that sort of quaint, arcane stuff. But he could, work to do that. And through that program, you could see for-profit charter schools or other, charter schools that just people don't like, being put a little bit behind the eight ball because somebody said they didn't like them. But if you want the money, you got to do what the federal government says.
Good. So, any other questions, Corey, from you? We don't want to keep you for too much longer because you've already stayed longer than your commitment, Neal. And this is
I could always give Neal more questions, but we're already over an hour. But
ordinarily, I would, at least 2.5 months ago, I would have been like, I got to stop because I got to drive home. Although I would have driven home like
you're
2 hours.
Home.
But yeah, see, now I'm already at home, so it's easy.
No, that's good. So I actually do have more on my list, which just means that we need to have you back to talk again sometime, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But we really appreciate you coming on. It's been an interesting conversation. I hope our listeners have been informed and entertained both. So we appreciate your time, Neal. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.
Thanks everyone watching. We'll be back on Friday with the Educational Freedom Institute podcast. Again, this was our special guest, Neal McCluskey, the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. And to remind everyone again, we have a co-edited volume coming out from the Cato Institute, School Choice Myths. It's available for $24.95 on Amazon. It's also available at Barnes & Noble. Go check it out. I'll share it again in the comments in a second. But thank you so much for joining us for another episode.